If your company has ever been sued, you know just how difficult it is to satisfy an electronic discovery request from backups. Extracting emails and other data from backups can take months, even if you have the resources and relevant skills to pull it off. Today, we talk to a company that makes doing this as simple as a handshake, while also providing a defensible audit record for your lawyers. We're talking with Brendan Sullivan, CEO and founder of Sullivan Strickler, who has over 30 years of expertise in storage. Learn about the challenges companies face when using legacy and backup data for eDiscovery, the importance of defensibility in the legal process, and how purpose-built software can make all the difference. By the way, if you don't know who I am, I'm W. Curtis Preston, aka Mr. Backup, and I've been passionate about backup and recovery and related topics for over 30 years. Ever since I had to tell my boss that we had no backups of the database that we had just lost. I don't want that to ever happen to you, and that's why I do this podcast. On this podcast, we turn unappreciated backup admins into cyber recovery heroes. This is the Backup Wrap-Up. Welcome to the show. I'm your host, W. Curtis Preston, aka Mr. Backup, and then with me, I have my emotional support consultant as they were working on my baby.
Your emotional support consultant?
I literally was sitting right here, and I had my Ring camera pointed directly on the other side of this wall at the mobile dent repair individual who was doing work on my Tesla Model 3. For those of you that follow the podcast, you heard a week or two ago that I had a little oopsie. But, the amazing world of the internet, I went to Yelp and I was like, I got to find a mobile, and I did this thing where I sent it out for bid. And then I got immediately, I got this quote. It's like, dude, I'll fix it. I'll be there. I'll come to your house. I'll do it there. He came here and it was really cool. I could watch. And I remember I was sending you pictures as it was going on. And you were like, oh, he's doing this. He's doing that. He's doing all the right things. So you were helping me.
Thank you, YouTube knowledge.
Yeah. Yeah. Once again, your YouTube knowledge came into being, and it turned out really well, right?
Yeah. No, it was amazing. And I'm surprised there aren't more mobile body shops, if you will, because if you had to go to a body shop, you go for an estimate, then you wait, then you got to drop the car off, then you got to figure out how you get to and from the place. You wait 3 days. Actually, some Teslas, you have to wait months to get repair parts, right?
Yeah,
and then it's just a hassle. And so, yeah, the fact that there was a mobile guy who came out, did everything, and the work looked amazing. So
you were helpful. As it was going on, I was sending photos of what was going on to you and to my wife. You were helpful. She was not. she was like, that looks bad. That looks bad. And I'm like, well, of course it looks bad. It's in the middle of body work.
Well, it's like when you're renovating or remodeling your house, right? You start off with something, they tear everything down. It looks awful. Yeah. And then after they're done, you're like, wow, this is amazing.
Yeah. Yeah. It looks, like nothing ever happened, which is exactly how you want it to look. So this is a sponsored episode today. This might be a first for me because in addition to being a sponsor, the person that we're actually bringing on happens to be my boss. So there's that. He has an extensive history in data storage and retrieval spanning over 30 years. He's an electrical engineer by education with over 20 years of experience in tape manufacturing. After that, he spent another 20 years advising companies on what to do with their legacy data. He's now the CEO and founder of Sullivan Strickler, which turns complexity into capability. Welcome to the podcast, Brendan Sullivan. How's it going, Brendan?
Not bad at all. Welcome, guys. I'm glad to be here.
Well, welcome to the pod. Let's go back to a little bit before the company. Tell us a little bit about that, the time that you spent in the manufacturing side, like how you got to, you gain the knowledge that you have now.
So it's always been storage for me in some way, shape, or form. I was at a company in South Wales that manufactured 64K static RAMs in 1985, and from there, the company didn't last tremendously long, and I took a job at another company that had won a contract to manufacture the first square tape cartridge in Europe, which was the 3480 tape cartridge, which obviously is an IBM mainframe tape cartridge, 200 megabytes. And that was in Bridgend in South Wales. So I took that job as a technician, and I've been in tape since 1985. And if I last just a few more years, then I can say from start to finish, my career will be tape in some way, shape, or form. So we made 3480, developed into making 3490E, and then also got involved and manufactured some of the TK50, TK52, which became the first DLT tape cartridge when metal particle coating came in, and we manufactured the first few versions of DLT also.
Yeah, for many of our listeners, those are all numbers that just rattle around and they don't mean anything to you. But for me, I'm thinking, oh yeah, I remember the 3480 and the TK50s, and I remember that when I first saw a DLT cartridge, I was like, oh, this is a TK50. Like it looks physically the same, just significantly different.
I can probably tell you the 27 parts that go into a DLT or went into a DLT tape cartridge and the type of plastic that was used on the injection molding, but nobody is interested these days.
Other than Curtis.
Curtis
kind of geeks out on this stuff.
Which is why I hired him.
You were in the business a little bit before me, just a little bit. I was cutting my teeth on all of those cartridges as they were like getting out of the industry, right? Like, because I had 9-track tapes and I had the TK50s and I had the QIC or quick cartridges, and the newest thing that we had in our world were the exabyte tapes, the 8mm tapes, right? Which then began a whole other world of tapes. But how did you go from that to the consultancy world?
So I ran a company that was called eMag Solutions. I was the president and CEO for about 9 years. And what became clear in the early part of that tenure, when I took over, it was still very much a manufacturing company, but we were not going to be making the latest and greatest LTO tape cartridges and 9840s and all these kind of technologies. They were becoming a little bit, they're open technology, but in terms of development of high coercivity particles that are required for the more modern tape storage, we just didn't have the investment to do that. So it was really a case of what have we learned in terms of tape manufacture, tape design, tape testing, because as a manufacturer, as you can imagine, you're testing the quality. What have we learned in those areas that can be applied to some kind of services in and around them? And it was really a case of thinking, what can we do? And so we actually acquired a small company under my tenure at eMag called Intermedia Graphics, and they'd specialized in this technique called non-native file restoration, which basically you restore data from somewhere other than using the software that was originally used to create the data. So it's code that originally for them it was codes that maybe a Word document that was that needed to be read from one system in another system, and that code, the core files are the same, the core data format is the same, but the way that those files are laid out on the storage medium are different by the backup software. And so non-native file restoration is basically a means to get hold of that data. So we acquired that small company and applied it to enterprise tape technology and also middleware kind of tape technology as well. And then the rest was really a little bit of luck in that business was not tremendous because it was hard to get the knowledge of that technology out. But we had a little bit of luck around the 2001 and to 2003 timeframe where eDiscovery was starting to gain a foothold in the market, and the producing data for use of evidence in a court of law. And when the data came from backup tapes, there wasn't that many companies that were able to do it. So we were asked on some of the big cases, like Enron case and some other cases, we were asked, can we get hold of this data? And that led our software developers to develop techniques to be able to restore and extract and perfect and improve our software. And by around about 2002, 2003, we were thinking, okay, this is our future. It was just growing at a rapid rate at that time. So that's really how we got into services.
So, one question, Brendan, is I know most people who might be listening to this podcast, they're probably like, oh, but you have, at least in today's world, right? You have normal file servers where you have SMB or you have NFS, and then you have object store, right? And they're all pretty standard, open, interoperable formats. Could you go a little into why this was such a problem in the backup space when you started this, or when you started seeing this problem?
So I will talk generally about legacy data, and this is really how over the last 20 years things have evolved. In that the data center typically is pushed and asked, and Curtis knows this only too well. I have more data. I would like to back it up faster. You have a backup window. That backup window is shrinking, and give me my servers back. So the backup software companies and the hardware companies were tasked with figuring out how to move larger amounts of data from different servers to back them up as quickly as they could. And over time came things like multiplexing, multi-threading, striping, spanning, NAS backups, NDMP, NAS filers, et cetera, and that's all good. You can back up data faster and more efficiently, but of course, what you're doing with that is you're you're putting the data into a storage medium in a more proprietary way, and that's fine as long as you're going to be doing the restoring. But then when the company 10 years later decides that it's going to back up to the cloud, or decides that it's going to back up in a different way, or maybe they get acquired and no longer have the Legato networker expert. Now they have a Veritas expert or a Commvault expert, and over time you lose the ability to be able to restore that data. And it's not always a problem, but what's also evolved in the industry is that data has become more and more used for evidence to prove out legal cases, and privacy requirements meaning ever more complex, challenging ways in which data has to be retained, preserved, and produced. And so the data center infrastructure is set up, let's say in 2010, for one system that's no longer serves its purpose in 2020, except the data must be kept. And as long as that scenario carries on, there will be space for companies like ours that we're keepers of lost knowledge. We're able to go back into 5-year, 10-year, 15, 20, 25 years and produce data that might be required for compliance or regulation or remediation or for business use, but largely litigation is a driver. And so it's today's modern is tomorrow's legacy, and that's not going to change.
Yeah.
Yeah, there's two things that I got out of there, Brendan. One is, and there was one that has come to my mind the more I work with your company is that I built my own career in doing consulting, helping people to basically redesign their backup system. But you found that there's a lot of technologies that sort of come and go, and then people lose their, that, like you said, they lose their networker person. What I found was even when they had a networker person, there was something about backup and especially tape that so much of it was counterintuitive that even if they had a networker person or a net backup person, the design wasn't in keeping with how how it should be designed, right? And so there was plenty of money to be made in helping people figure out how to back up, right? What it never really occurred to me until working with you was that just like there are very few people that are really good at doing backups, there's an even smaller group of people that are really good at doing restores. Because the one thing about backup is that most people do it every day. If they have a backup system, they're constantly working on their backups, right? They're working, they've got a backup window, they've got to do backups at a certain time, they've got to get them done in a certain size, in a certain time. And there's a new server and we got to configure this. So you get really good at that. And you say, well, when's the last time you did a restore? Well, we restored this one file a month ago, as a test, or maybe we do a restore of a small file now and then to test. But no one tests the kind of restores that your team is doing.
And to go along with that, Curtis, it's those restore tests that the backup person is doing is for operational recoveries, right? Like, hey, I blew away a file or something. It's not for, I need to satisfy an eDiscovery request, which has its own set of requirements that go along with it.
Yeah, which is the other thing, right? So one is people just in general aren't good at doing restores, right? And the second is that, you talked about all these proprietary formats. All of them have one thing in common, and that's that none of them were designed for eDiscovery, right? This is why when you and I first started talking, I remember saying something to you of like, you do realize that I've spent my entire career trying to talk people out of doing the thing that makes them end up needing your services, right? Like, please don't use your backup software as your archive software. But no one listens to me. Because the vast majority of the industry just uses their backup system and hopes they never need to do an eDiscovery.
You're exactly right. There's, I often say there's really two reasons for our existence, and the first one is that the requirement to keep the data lasts longer than the requirement to keep the infrastructure that you use to create the data. That's point number one. And then point number two, the requirements to produce that data are more complex and more involved than were envisioned at the time that data was created. And of course, that's eDiscovery, right, litigation, compliance, regulatory reasons. I mean, if you look at now, this last 3-4 years, data privacy regulations that are taking hold, GDPR and CCPA and many others, there are provisions that are being stipulated, things like the right to be forgotten. If you've collected personal data, then you have a right to be forgotten. So you leave the company has your personal data that might not be data that is allowed or they're allowed to have in the public domain. And so you say, okay, well, I'm no longer there. Can you remove it? Now, if these are in backups or archives, that's a major challenge, especially if you no longer have the infrastructure around that was used to create it. So now there's a whole remediation requirement, the ability to delete on demand from data that is co-populated with data that you must keep. So it's actually getting more complex, not less complex, and which is great for us. This is how we want the market to evolve.
Yeah, it was the same thing that happened to me, years ago when basically tape drive just kept getting faster and faster. and which just made my side of the world worse, right? Because the problem, as I saw it for 20 years, was that tape drives had gotten too fast for the backup, right? And the backup can only run at one speed, and the tape drive can only run speed, and the speeds aren't anywhere near the same speed, right? That's how we invented multiplexing, and but the problem was that everybody always saw it as the opposite. They're like, oh, the tape drives are slow, and so I'm going to I'm going to buy more tape drives. And I was always like, no, right? But the faster tape drives got, the better it was for me, because the worse the backup systems were. And I just looked better and better by fixing all those, right? So you've talked about eDiscovery. What does that look like? Does somebody decide they need your kind of services versus whatever the alternatives might be?
I would say the vast majority of clients or prospects that are required to produce data from backup systems are not aware of the type of technologies that we've developed in the industry. So often when we get on a scoping call, it might, let's just say hypothetically, it might be a net backup environment, and they might have to produce emails or messages from an email archiving platform or something that's been managed through net backup or backup exec. And the conversations go, okay, so how are you going to do this? And the thought process is, do we know what sessions there are? Will you do phase one imports? Will you do phase two imports? And we go, no, we don't use net backup. We use our own software. And they say, well, how are you going to restore the data if you don't have net backup? And so there's always and we'll say we don't need it, because we basically trick the tape cartridge into thinking it's talking to something like a net backup environment, and therefore we can do all sorts of things with this data. We don't necessarily need the tapes in sequence like the native software does. We don't necessarily need to go through everything systematically to get the complete session restored. And this is what you have to do in eDiscovery. You have to go, the whole objective here is to cast the net wide, capture everything that is relevant for the potential case, and ignore as much as you can that isn't, so you're not collecting too much data, and just go straight for the specific files. And that leads an ideal environment for the lawyers to be somebody that can find, pinpoint, and restore as little as possible, but restore exactly what is required, and then produce that data in a defensible way, preserving all metadata as you do it, and then reviewing and analyzing and producing through that case. So that, for us, what we've done is we've built our own software. So we have a piece of software that is fundamentally 2 points. One is that it'll drive the devices, so it's kind of like all the SCSI mechanisms and what have you, all the buffers. And then the rest is our coders create handlers that allow us to restore all sorts of different backup softwares. So whether it be net backup, backup exec, Commvault, Tivoli, Legato, et cetera, it's the same piece of software. And then the key skills that get added to that are, we might not need the whole session, we might not need the whole thread. So then it's a case of what do you need to learn about the backup environment, and what's the most cost-effective, efficient, fastest way to go about learning that environment. And that's really the features and benefits of our tool that allow us to be that early part of an eDiscovery process before the data gets loaded into a platform where the lawyers or the paralegals can review it and decide that it's relevant for the case.
And if you compare, and I don't know if you have numbers around this, but like doing the normal way that a backup person who was, say, using that backup and would have had to go through in terms of restoring each of the sessions to a location, doing everything using that backup versus using the software that you guys have created, what sort of like efficiency gains are there to be had by going with what you do versus like what a person would normally have to do for a relatively large environment to handle that eDiscovery case?
Well, the first and most obvious one is that we work off backups, whether or not that be a disk backup or a tape backup. We work off backups, which means that the data center folks don't have to change their lives at all. And so that's a huge efficiency. Hand us the data, we'll take it from here. Um, that's an order of magnitude advantage, and also it's being used to the legal world. They have it's all about defensibility, all about audit trails, all about response time, availability, project management. Once you've been through your first 100 projects like that, you really get to know the kind of things that they ask for, and that's a big factor. So a company that's going through litigation for the first time or second time, that's a big education they've got to go through. So we deal with the backups, and therefore we don't interfere with normal operation. The second thing is that the infrastructure that data centers are often have are built for purpose. They have a certain amount of data they're backing up. They have certain processes, and if you're going to have to second certain amounts of that infrastructure, it's going to interfere with your normal.
Something's got to give.
Yeah, something's got to give. And then the third thing is it's defensibility. If you're in a legal situation and you're getting accused of something, and you might ultimately have to testify in a court of law as to what you did, what you produced, and how you produced it, there's a much better defensibility from a third-party company like ours than one of your employees. That could potentially be argued by opposing counsel that, oh well, how do we know that you had an interest in finding what we're looking for?
Yeah.
So those three things make it ideal, really, and smart to pick out a third party rather than actually do it yourself.
I think your answer was great. I think the question Prasanna was maybe asking was a little bit different, and because your answer was about why would somebody use you versus doing it themselves. What I would like to see you hone in on is just the actual. Let's assume you had unlimited resources. Well, you never had unlimited resources, but let's say you had a tape library and you had a net backup server. For setting aside the conflicting part, how efficient would you say your process of reading everything that needs to be read, restoring everything needs to be restored, versus doing that same process but using pick your favorite backup software and doing it that way?
So in our data center in Atlanta, I don't know how many tape drives we have, but it's probably 2,000 plus. And if somebody drops 500 tapes on us and they don't know, they have a keyword search requirement, they have a file requirement, but they don't know where it is, we can go 100 wide day one. And so in terms of the speed, and then we can just scan, some of the features that I mentioned in our software, eDiscovery is all about ruling out. So it's not about throwing all of the tapes in and restoring. It's about scanning them in the most efficient way. Can you rule it out by date? Can you rule it out by backup session type, data content type? It's all about ruling out as fast as you can. So we go fast and wide, and we rule out. So the devil's in the detail because it depends on what the matter is. But if it was that 500 tape project that you might try and tackle internally, and you've got your net backup or your environment there, you might spend months, whereas we might spend days in terms of getting to the data. So it really can be quite significant.
Yeah, so it sounds like it's a combination of the fact that you actually do have not unlimited, but a significant number of tape drive. That I've been in environments that have hundreds of tape drives, but those are really, really rare. Most people have just enough tape drives. You spoke to this in your previous answer. Most people have just enough tape drives to get the job done. And by the way, it's not just tape drives. We've talked a lot about tape, but they may have a disk array, right, to do that job, and that disk system has its job to do. And then there's people, right? The fact that you've written a piece of software that is purpose built for what you're doing. NetBackup, Networker, TSM, pick your favorite backup software. None of them were written to do this.
Correct.
None of them, if you're looking for, we have hundreds of backups and we don't know where this file is, they are not written for that. Some of them have a little bit of search capability, but to say, I've been backing up, I mean, what percentage of eDiscovery cases are email? It's really high, right?
It's high. Yeah, it's still very high. It used to be 100%, but almost 100%, but it's still 70%, I would say.
Yeah. Okay. So if you're going to do an email eDiscovery case, if you're doing this with backups, you have to restore dozens to hundreds of copies of Exchange.
Didn't
right?
you have to do
And
this
doing
before,
that,
Curtis?
What's that?
Didn't you do this once for a consulting gig?
Yeah. Did this once. It was very lucrative for the consulting company that I worked for at the time. But that is, it's just simply not designed. You talked about going wide. Backup software isn't designed to go wide. Backup software is designed to go narrow. I need to restore this server, this directory, this database to this point in time. It is not designed to go find the needle in the haystack, right? And I like what you said about how that eDiscovery is all about. What did you say? You said all about excluding, all about
ruling out.
Ruling out, right? Yeah, ruling out in a defensible way, right? Here is the process by which we ruled stuff out, and if you change your mind, we have all the metadata, so we can unrule things out. I just totally made up a phrase, but if you did that with pick your favorite backup software, every time you go through is a separate process, right? Yep. It's interesting now that I think about it, because you said it's about ruling out. That's not the way backup software works, right? In backup software, you need to tell it what you want, right? Not, hey, I want you to look at everything, but don't look at these things, and just give me these things, but give them over this 3-year period. That isn't the way backup software works.
So you've raised a point that it's something from a marketing perspective I've always been a little bit uncomfortable with, and it's because of the vernacular, the terminologies that are used, backup. So it's easier for us to say we're experts in backup. The truth is that backup softwares companies are experts in backup, and they call the product BUR, backup and restore, but it only ever gets called backup. All we do is the R. We don't do any backup. But if we say we're a restore company, it can get completely misunderstood. So you say, yeah, we're backup experts. But the truth is, we don't do any backup. We only do restore.
Well, and to become restore experts, you have to be backup experts, right? Because without that, right, you're just downstream. So you have to really be entrenched and really deeply knowledgeable about the backup in order to be able to restore really well. The one thing, Curtis, going back to your point about sort of the number of tape drives and like how normally in your backup infrastructure, you only have enough infrastructure to get the stuff done. Imagine if you went as a backup person at a company, you went to the CIO and was like, hey, I need $10 million extra dollars to have 1,000 more tape drives so I can handle an eDiscovery request. That might happen every once in a while, right? Already backup folks are strapped for budget, right? And
Right.
going and saying, yes, I need this in order to be able to handle an e-discovery request, which may or may not happen, may be unpredictable. You don't know what the scope is. You can't be like, hey, I'm always going to search these servers or only emails, right? It all depends on what the case is. So you can't really predict that. And so you might have to size for the largest or size for the smallest, and then your window goes out the door, right? So
Yeah, I do want to speak to the world of disk backups because, as you know, Brendan, a lot of the world has gone to disk. I mean, you guys live in the world of tape, but you also speak the world of disk, and so I just wanted to speak to that world as well. Your efficiency comes from both from the fact that you can go so wide because you do have all those tape resources, but also because if you were handed a large, I know I talked to you just today about how a customer had shipped their data domain box to you, right? And you can also very easily create multiple sessions against that, right?
The technology is similar, the same, but requires tweaking. Our software requires tweaking. But it's interesting about that project that we talked about today. That we were restoring exchanged instances, thousands of custodians from data domain infrastructure, and the lawyers always called it tape, and we never touched a tape. And in the
That's
end,
funny.
we couldn't stop them saying, have you restored these tapes yet, or have you restored those tapes yet? We couldn't stop that. So it was all coming off data domain. We never touched a tape, but we still used our software and tweaked our software to be able to first restore the backups from within the data domain, and then extract exchange, and then extract custodian PSD messages, mailboxes, etc. Um,
Can you speak to that word, by the way? That was a word that was new to me when coming to
custodians.
the company, was custodian. Can you speak to that word?
it's a mailbox user. So what often gets used is if you're in a large company and there's 6,000 mailbox users, so you might have 6,000 mailbox users on an exchange environment, and then 3 people are under investigation for whatever reason, and we have to produce the mailboxes, multiple instances, whether they be from fulls, incrementals, differentials, whatever. If we have to produce all of the instances of that mailbox user, the term that is used is those 3 custodians.
It's a legal term, right?
Yeah, I guess.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's just, for me, historically, that word, I mean, it meant someone who took care of the data. So I always thought of a data custodian as like I have thought of myself as a data custodian,
Yeah.
but that's not the way it's meant in this context. That's why I just wanted to make sure we threw that out.
So, Brendan, I know we've been talking a lot about e-discovery, but are there other use cases that you see people also needing this capability? Like, I used to work for backup vendors, many backup vendors, and one of the challenges that people would always have is like, hey, I have name your backup vendor. I want to leave them and switch to your solution, but I have all this data and I don't know what to really do with it. And I don't want to continue paying the maintenance contracts and other things. And I'm not sure what to do with that. Is that something that you guys also hear from customers? And do you have the ability to help them with those
It's
issues?
increasingly. In fact, I would say that there are 2 fundamental reasons for our technology. One is the remediation side of it, and the other is the specific litigation discovery side of it. So it's the federal rules of civil procedure of kind of guide make it easy or difficult, and they've changed over recent years that make it a little easier, a little more justifiable to remediate, delete certain data. And what we think has happened from that, coupled with the growth in cloud and the demise of email archive platforms, what's happened is that migration is much more topical, and our technology lends itself extremely, ideally for migration. But I think the what so many companies really want to do is delete. I see the main objective is deletion on demand, is I think the term that I'd coin. So, if you have 50 petabytes of data that spanning back 15, 20 years, the reality of you needing that or having to keep all of that is a nonsense. You don't. But there is some in there that you really should, because if you don't, it could land you in trouble, or it could have some value. And so migration is the driver. We would like to take our legacy environment, and we would like to put it in a more modern environment, a cloud-based backup system or something like that. And then we say, okay, hundreds of terabytes of data, we can migrate that, and it's controlled often by the bandwidth of the legacy infrastructure. So if it's an email archiving platform like a Source One, where support is going away at the end of this year, and migration of data out of those environments are limited by the speed that Source One infrastructure can migrate those messages out, but you've got to migrate them out to be able to remediate, to be able to delete, to be able to keep whatever you want. It's complex, it's slow, and the ability to take the storage environment of those legacy environments and go fast and wide is highly valuable. But that's the driver. It's not just the migration that's the driver; it's the deletion. Because it's like turning over the stone. This is offsite storage vendors have made a lot of money for many years of keeping stuff. And if you don't look at something, maybe it's not there. If you look at it and you know it's there, then you have to do something with it. So the challenge is for us in terms of what technology we develop. We need that. The clients need that technology to be able to migrate quickly, delete defensibly, and delete on demand. So it's not just migration; it's migration and deletion, which the term I would use generally is remediation of data. It's a growing market, and data privacy is only making that come more to the fore. And companies, there's a lot of companies out there that want their backed up archive data in the cloud so that they can forever remove infrastructure within their data center and just put it all up in the cloud, which it makes perfect sense to remediate that data before it goes to the cloud, not en masse.
Because even though cloud is cheap, especially when you talk about deep storage, it is still a cost. And if you keep adding that up over the months and the years that you're keeping that data for, right, those costs can add up.
It's only cheap on the way in. Yeah. It's only cheap on the way in. It's expensive on the way out. Egress is what's going to hurt.
Yeah. Although I did hear that at least AWS and some of the other public cloud companies, due to EU regulations, are now have removed egress costs if you are canceling your account. So they're at least starting to help there, but it doesn't help if you need to pull data out just for a one-off case or something else like that.
Yeah, I can see all kinds of migrations here, right? I can see, I know that. So there are plenty of people that are still on tape and they want to keep the tapes, but they realize that they have a bunch of DLT1 tapes. And you could put, I don't know how many DLT1 tapes you can put on an LTO8, right? Or an LTO9. But you guys can do that, right? You can migrate and remediate there. You can keep everything, but keep it in a much smaller space, reducing your monthly bill from whoever it is that's holding onto your tapes. Or if you're holding onto your own tapes, reduce your data center footprint of that. You can migrate data into some sort of cloud storage, like you said, remediate along the way. You say, look, we've got all these backups, and the only thing we want to keep out of them is the exchange data. You can do that, right? You can extract just the exchange data or just the whatever data, whatever it is. You can extract that out defensibly because maybe they've got a a regulatory requirement to keep that, or maybe they've got a voice system and they have to keep those records. Whatever it is that they have to keep, you can make sure that they keep that, but delete everything else, migrating that into whatever kind of system that they want to do. And I know we've even talked about ways in which that you could potentially migrate it into another backup system. Definitely more complicated, I think, but it's doable. But obviously, it's a high level of effort, which would be costly. So then the customer would just have to make a decision as to whether or not. I think that was not a question. I just talked for 5 minutes. Brendan, we've talked about the backups. We've talked about the remediation side and eDiscovery. But as I recall, there's also another part of the company that talks about forensics. What? So it sounds like you're just handling all the data that needs to be collected.
Yeah, so the backup that we've said is not really what we do. We do the restore. The process, the legal process is best understood from a model that's been created. It's called the EDRM model, Electronic Discovery Reference Model, and you can follow it. And there's a process which is identification of target data over on one side and all the way to produce in a court of law on the other side. And the restoration and production of data from legacy environments that we've talked about thus far is really on the left-hand side of that EDRM model. And more on the right side is the forensic side and the eDiscovery side, which is where the analysis of the data. So just getting the target data is what we've talked about thus far. And inevitably, when we're doing that, some clients, they say, well, that's only part of the process. We'd ultimately like you to actually find the data or help us find the specific data that might be used for defense or for whatever the lawyers are trying to achieve. And so that part is much more analysis, keyword search, artificial intelligence, machine learning, computer aided learning that allows platforms to sift through fully indexed all sorts of data very, very quickly and build a story that the lawyers can use as fast and efficiently as possible. So we do have two other departments besides the restore side. We have computer forensics, where we have certified forensic examiners that typically look at laptops, PCs, Windows servers, but more recently it's iPhones and Androids. There's a lot of data on those devices now, using technologies like Celebrite and NCase and X-Ways and various other things. So we have a computer forensics department that our examiners specifically work in that area, producing and reviewing things like WhatsApp chat messages, Signal chat messages, etc. Teams is coming just around the corner. And then the eDiscovery platform, which is the actual where the data actually resides and where lawyers and paralegals will search and review and then tag relevant data and then come back to them to build the stories that they will send to opposing counsel or ultimately go to court to produce. We also have a eDiscovery department, and they're not the largest parts of our portfolio, but they're an essential part, and they're growing because what clients want is they want you to be able to handle everything from the far left to as far right as possible.
Yeah, you guys are like the experts. And so if you're a company, you have no idea where to start, and you're like, hey, I got this request. I have a bunch of data. I don't know what to do. It's like, hey, I should give a call to you guys and be like, hey, I need help.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think, remember, one of the biggest surprises for me was when I was looking at all the things that you do was that eDiscovery part, right? So we were talking about Microsoft 365, and you were explaining how that you do you use the customer's eDiscovery tool in Microsoft 365. And I remember asking, well, why don't they just do that? And you're like, well, because it's really hard, right? Because it's a very complicated. And again, going back to something you said much earlier, is you want to be able to defensibly say that you did this in the proper way, that you conducted the search in a proper way, so that you can say, here's what we did, and here's how, here's what we've collected, and here's the process that we used to collect that, and that's a defensible process, versus somebody who is clicking on Microsoft 365's eDiscovery button for the first time.
I can see you doing that, Curtis.
Let me tell you, Curtis is a fast learner.
I try. Well, with that, Brendan, thanks for coming on.
Thanks for having me.
And thanks, Prasanna, for your usual great questions as well.
Yeah, I try, Curtis. And Brendan, it was nice to meet you.
You too.
And thanks to our listeners. Be sure to subscribe so that you don't miss an episode. That is a wrap. The Backup Wrap-Up is written, recorded, and produced by me, W. Curtis Preston. If you need backup or DR consulting, content generation, or expert witness work, check out backupcentral.com. You can also find links for my O'Reilly books on the same website. Remember, this is an independent podcast, and any opinions that you hear are those of the speaker and not necessarily an employer. Thanks for listening.